Hi! Now that we have covered some of the very basic concepts of the digestive system, we will start to discuss the different parts as for their anatomy and physiology, progressing part by part, following the path that food takes in the digestive tract. So why don't we get started by looking at the very first part? And I would like to begin by asking you that where does the digestion start? And of course, it is the mouth and associated structures that most textbooks and students offer as an answer. But I would take a step even further back and say that it may be even before that. It is the sight, smell, and so on that can trigger salivation. And saliva itself contains digestive enzymes, such as salivary amylase that breaks down starch. So I guess that one could say that the digestion can start even before the food makes it to the mouth. So let's think of a mouth in a general level, beyond just its role in the digestive system. What is mouth an important structure for? Well, of course, we had the fact that this is where the food enters to the digestive system, but it also plays an important role in our communication through the speech and also as sensory receptor site. We evaluate if something is fit to be eaten, or in case of a developing psychology, a child explores much of its early world through mouth, right? And some terms that can be used to discuss this structure are oral and buccal cavity. I think we should also define the borders of the mouth. So anteriorly, it is the lips that define the border. And laterally, on the sides, cheeks are the important structure. Without them, the food would fall out of the mouth. The roof of the mouth is formed by the soft and hard palate, with the hard being more anterior and soft posterior. And then inferiorly, a tongue plays a major role. Note how tongue is actually much larger than we often think of. And of course, posteriorly, it would be the oropharynx. And one more term that I do want to introduce here is the oral vestibule. The term vestibule itself refers to the chamber. So it is the space between the teeth and gums and the lips. So let's discuss a little bit about the tongue. Notice that the tongue itself is composed of the intercalated bundles of skeletal muscles. So manipulating the shape or position of the tongue depends greatly on what muscle groups are being used. Another thing that I want to highlight here is the term papillae. These are small rounded projections on the tongue. And the term frenulum refers to the small fold or ridge that connects the tongue to the floor of the mouth. Sometimes frenulum can be cut when a baby has trouble with latching. Another interesting structure that we see here is the hanging projection at the back of the mouth, known as uvula. And I have a bit of a curiosity to show here, a bifid uvula, which means an uvula that has divided in two. So next, let's talk about the saliva. Saliva is important for many reasons. It cleanses the mouth, dissolves food chemicals so that they are available for taste, moistens the food in mouth so that we can form it into this solid ball-like structure that is easier to swallow. And saliva is responsible for the food breakdown starting already at the level of the mouth as salivary amylase enzyme starts to break starches. And there are two types of salivary glands. Most of the saliva is produced by the major salivary glands, which are located outside the mouth. And then there are some minor salivary glands which do not contribute that much. We will be focusing on the extrinsic major ones. And we will be using this listing to assist us as we review these. So first one that we will have a look of is the parotid salivary gland. This is located next to the ear above the masseter muscle, which you might remember from our review of muscles of mastication interface. A good way to remember its name is that parrot sits on the shoulder of a parrot, so the parotid gland is roughly where it would be placed. And this gland produces very serous secretions, meaning that it is fairly watery. And these are released at the top part of the mouth next to the second molar. The next one that we will have a look of is going to be the submandibular salivary gland. This is located within the mandible, more or less medially. And it releases its secretions next to the base of the lingual frenulum. Remember that small fold or ridge in the base of the tongue that we had a look of earlier. The secretion of the mandibular gland is a mix of serous and mucus. Finally, let's have a look of the sublingual salivary gland. As name suggests, it's located under the tongue. This one opens at several points at the floor of the mouth, and its secretions are mucus. So, how much saliva do you produce in a day? It is about 1,500 milliliters, which to me seems like quite a big amount, doesn't it? Saliva is mostly water, about 97 to 99.5%. It is just slightly acidic, so just below pH 7. Saliva contains several electrolytes, as well as salivary amylase and lingual lipase. There are also proteins and some metabolic wastes like urea and uric acids present. Now, let's have a look of teeth just quickly. So we have primary teeth, which are sometimes known as milk teeth or baby teeth, and secondary permanent teeth. So while we have 20 primary teeth, the number of permanent teeth is 32. And dentistry may be the field to go, as although we are taking better care of our teeth, people have also longer life expectancy. So maintaining teeth is very important for us. And classifying teeth is actually quite easy. Just divide the mouth into 4 areas where they are all repeated in. Let's have a look of this. So, incisors are located at the front, in total 8 of them. They are especially well adjusted to things like biting apple. So chisel-shaped teeth, ideal for cutting. Canines are teeth that are ideal for tearing or piercing foodstuff. There are 4 of them in total. Then premolars, there are 8 of them. And sometimes they are known as bicuspids. Their shape is having a broad crown with rounded cusps. This makes them ideal for grinding and crushing food. And finally, molars. We have 12 of these. And again, they can be described as having broad crowns and rounded cusps. Excellent for grinding. And when upper and lower jaw meet, these create a significant force. We are not going to spend a lot of time looking at the tooth structure, but you can see that it can be divided roughly into 2 portions. The part above gum is known as the crown, and it contains enamel, which is the hardest or one of the hardest substances in the body. We also have dentin, which forms bulk of the tooth, and central canal, where the blood vessels, nerves, and connective tissue are located. The part below gum is known as the root. There, the cementum cements the tooth into its socket, and we also have periodontal ligament, which further anchors the teeth. So I think that we have now talked a fair bit about the mouth. Let's continue a review of the alimentary canal. So next we have pharynx. We talked about it quite a bit when we covered the respiratory system. Now we do not need to worry about the nasopharynx, as it is reserved only for the air. But we are interested in the oro and laryngopharynx. These are where both food and air pass. After these comes esophagus. This is just a muscle tube, about the length of 25 centimeters. It has very little digestive function, but rather just connects the lower laryngopharynx, to the stomach. What is interesting is, though, that as it is a muscular tube, it helps to move food or drink to the stomach, regardless to the position where you are. You can drink water while standing on your head, and the water will move up to the stomach, thanks to the peristaltic waves which we saw earlier. Same goes for being able to drink and eat in space where there is no gravity. One thing that I do want to note is that at this point, when food and saliva have been mixed in the mouth, we have already done some mechanical breaking and formed a ball that is easier to swallow and pass to the stomach. We no longer talk about food, but a bolus. This is a mix of food and saliva that makes this ball that is easier to manipulate in the digestive tract. And what is actually quite interesting is that if we look at microscopic image of the esophagus, we can still see the same layers that we discussed at the beginning of our review of digestive system. Mucosa, which protected the structures. Note that there is no crossing of materials in esophagus. Submucosa, the layer below. And muscular layer, which facilitated this wave-like movement of peristalsis. Note that we have serosa or adventitia too, which anchors this to its place. Next, I will introduce a fancy word, deglutition. What does it mean? Well, it means just swallowing. And let's look at the swallowing process a little bit. First, the soft palate and uvula move up, sealing off the nasal cavity. Then epiglottis closes off the trachea so that food or liquid swallowed does not go by accident to the lungs. This is followed by the throat jumping up and anteriorly to catch the bolus. And then the bolus just travels down esophagus where peristaltic movements move it. My question for you is that, is swallowing voluntary or involuntary? Turns out it is first voluntary, but once initiated, it cannot be stopped, so it becomes involuntary. Now we are ready to talk about the stomach. It is this slightly J-shaped structure, about 25 to 30 centimeters in size. Stomach is located below the diaphragm, so the esophagus has to go through the diaphragm. In terms of the location, stomach is located at the upper left part of the abdominal cavity. If we think of the function of the stomach, it is not much more than a temporary storage site for what has now become from bolus to chyme. The term chyme refers to this paste-like mass, which is more liquid than the bolus. It is now a mixture of more than just food and saliva, but also contains stomach secretions. Often we see pictures or diagrams of stomach where it is this ball-like structure, but in reality, it is empty a lot of the time, and not at all this smooth and rounded structure. Instead, when empty, we will see rugae on its surface. These are folds which facilitate this significant growth in volume, which can take place when an empty stomach is distended to become full. And what I want to talk next is the different parts of the stomach. Let's have a look at that. And you can see that the stomach starts from where the esophagus ends and ends where the small intestine begins. So we will talk about all the parts between these. So the first one that I want us to note is the part where esophagus joins the stomach. This is known as the cardia. Above that, so more superior, is the part that we call fundus. This part is important for us to know because sometimes there may be air in the stomach, and this is where it would build up to. Then we have the largest part of the stomach, known as body. Then this is followed by pylorus, which the last part of the stomach, and there are actually two parts here. The pyloric antrum, followed by canal. But let's talk a little bit about what else we can add to this. There must be some way to control both ends of the stomach. And this is with sphincters. Where esophagus joins the cardia, we have something known as the lower esophageal sphincter. This prevents backflow of the stomach acid into esophagus. Sometimes this fails and we may get heartburn. So nothing to do with the heart. It is rather stomach acid irritating esophagus. Some causes for this may be, for example, excess food or drink, obesity, pregnancy, or even running. If this is prolonged and unattended, we may end up with esophageal ulcers. And if even then continued, these may develop cancerous. I do want to highlight regarding lower esophageal sphincter that is more of a physiological than anatomical sphincter. And then we have, of course, another sphincter, and this is known as pyloric sphincter. This is located just before small intestines and controls when and how chyme is being let there. A few more terms that I want to introduce. We have lesser curvature and greater curvature of the stomach. And this is a good time for us to mention hernia. There are different kinds of, but the main gist is that an organ bulges out from somewhere where it should not be bulging through. And one quite common is the hernia of the stomach through diaphragm. You might remember when we talked about the muscular layers in the digestive system, and I mentioned that the stomach is kind of a special one as it has a third type of oblique ones. This allows more distension and mixing, which consequently are important functions of the stomach. Now let's do a little bit of physiology and talk about secretions of the stomach. What we find is that the stomach is lined with simple columnar epithelium, and among there are gastric pits. These are these depressions. And in there we have gastric glands, which produce gastric juice as secretions. In fact, about 3 liters of this is produced each day. What I have done next is to condense all of the important information about stomach secretions in one summary. So let's go through it together. So first one that we will have a look of is the pepsinogen. It is secreted from the chief cells, but it remains inactive, so does not do much unless we have hydrochloric acid present. And this we get from the parietal cells. The presence of hydrochloric acid activates pepsinogen, making it pepsin, which is an active form and responsible for protein splitting. Another thing that happens due to the hydrochloric acid is that gastric lipase, which is responsible for splitting fats. Remember lipids, this is secreted from chief cells. But it remains weak due to the pH of the stomach, which is due to the hydrochloric acid. So gastric lipase will reach its full effect in fat splitting only at the small intestines where the pH conditions are neutralized. Now, another thing that we have to consider is that how come the hydrochloric acid does not dissolve the stomach wall? Well, goblet cells and mucus glands secrete mucus, which protects the wall of the stomach. And finally, the last one that I want to mention is our intrinsic factor. This one is secreted from parietal cells, and it plays a key role in vitamin B12 absorption. So there you have it, our major stomach secretions and their roles. Now I think that it would be interesting to consider, what if the stomach layer is broken? In this case, we have, of course, an ulcer. These are caused by damage to the stomach wall, and this can be due to stomach acid, certain bacteria, or for example aspirin, which is a strong anti-inflammatory pain reliever. So that's why we need to be careful about aspirin. So there can be upper abdominal pain, but it can also be symptomless. So what can we do? Well, we will try to decrease the stomach acid production with certain drugs. And if there has been bacteria involved, we will use antibiotics. So that's it. I think that next we should look at the phases of the secretion of gastric juices. Let's discuss this just briefly. So what happens in the first phase is that just the sight, thinking of, scent, or taste triggers the cephalic phase reflex. This gives rise to the gastric phase, which lasts 3 to 4 hours and results in release of the gastric juice. Some things that can stimulate this are distension of the stomach, as well as certain chemicals like proteins, caffeine, and so on. On the contrary, low pH, for example, would inhibit this phase. Then finally, at the intestinal phase, there is first a stimulation and then inhibition. The stimulation would be the food entering small intestines, which encourages the production. However, inhibition is by the wall of small intestine, and especially duodenum, being stretched, acidity of the small intestine, and fatty content. The last is because fat takes more time to digest. So this inhibition keeps the amount of material in small intestine manageable. Now, I think that we should finish off with a consideration of why the stomach is not well adapted to absorption. What explanation can you think? Well, some that I would put forward include that the acidic environment of the stomach prevented activation of many digestive secretions. Also, the lack of villi in the stomach surface means that there is less surface area for disabsorption. And then, of course, we have the mucus layer, which prevents absorption through it. Therefore, we will note that the main site of absorption will be the small intestine. And just as we are about to finish off this video, I want to remind us about the important terminology so that we use the correct words for correct locations. When food was mechanically manipulated and mixed with saliva in the mouth, it becomes bolus. Then, when bolus is mixed with gastric juice in the stomach, it now becomes chyme. And as we remove water from chyme, as we'll see in the next video, it becomes feces. I hope that this summary makes sense. So, let's wrap up this video here, and in the next video, we will continue this journey of the food.